the number of people who are dying around the country because they're getting misinformation that is leading them to not take a vaccine. Young people, old people, kids, children, this is all a lot of them are being impacted by misinformation.
Virtually all of the COVID-19 hospitalizations and deaths continue to be among the unvaccinated.
I think there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and outright lies about that, and that's really unfortunate. My job is to do what I can as a scientist to preserve and protect the health of the American public, and indirectly, in many respects, the health of the world.
Dr. Anthony Fauci.
Anthony Fauci.
COVID-19 cases.
Coronavirus.
The NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute.
Well, I think that what we had seen during COVID, in the lead up to the 2020 election, we saw this just massive effort by the federal government to work with big tech to suppress dissenting views. And that's an un-American thing to do. And so we filed a lawsuit. It was a landmark lawsuit. And what we uncovered in that lawsuit was a vast censorship enterprise, broader and bigger than anybody could have ever imagined. And so I think once we got into it, we were even more emboldened to continue to push forward, because whether it was, when Anthony Fauci spoke, big tech censored, or the Hunter Biden laptop, or just these special channels that had been established between big tech and big government, it needed to be exposed, and we got to make sure it never happens again.
This material might be the most important material we've found about the potential origins of COVID, and certainly the big lies put out there by the Fauci agency that it had nothing to do with gain-of-function research in Wuhan. When you say you're creating mutant coronaviruses in order to figure out how they can infect humanized mice, that's gain-of-function 101, and we've got proof positive here with these documents.
This paper that you were referring to was judged by qualified staff up and down the chain as not being gain-of-function. Let me finish.
You take an animal virus and you increase its transmissibility to humans,
right.
You're saying that's not gain-of-function?
Yeah, that is correct.
Understand, we now know that Dr. Fauci gave our tax dollars to a lab in Wuhan, China that wasn't up to code, that was doing gain-of-function research, and that's where the leak came from. That is almost, I believe that just as sure as I'm sitting here talking to you. But I think most people who have common sense now, and who follow this now understand that. I think Fauci knew that from the get-go. And he couldn't have that out. He couldn't have Dr. Fauci in his fiefdom handing out billions of dollars over the years, highest paid guy in the government, Mr. Know-it-all, Dr. Fauci. He couldn't let that get out that he had been using our money to fund gain-of-function research. And he knew it from the very get-go.
We also, in that deposition, confronted him with an email very early on in 2020 where a friend said, hey, Anthony Fauci, I'm getting on a plane. Should I be wearing a mask? And he responds, no, masks are ineffective. Then, of course, our school kids are subjected, 5-year-olds are subjected to wearing masks all day long, and we know the negative outcomes now. And so anybody that objected to this, anybody who stood up to, this sort of COVID authoritarianism, this biomedical authoritarianism that existed, they were deplatformed.
You had government officials debating whether it was a lab leak, but God forbid Americans wanted to debate it. They got censored because these government officials decided that the debate was too dangerous to have.
January 31st, 2020, Dr. Fauci gets an email from Dr. Christian Anderson, one of these virologists he's given our money to. That email said, now remember, this is right at the start, January 31st, 2020, he gets this email and says, virus looks engineered, virus is not consistent with evolutionary theory. That is a fancy way of saying this thing came from a lab. And Fauci goes he starts emailing people, his top assistant at midnight, he's doing another email at 2 in the morning, organizes a conference call the next day. He gets on this conference call with 10 virologists from around the country who've all got our money. By the way, one of the guys on the call, Dr. Gary, also says that, I don't know how this happens in nature, it'd be easy to do in a lab, on February 1st on this call. And then 3 days later, everybody changes their story. Anderson and Gary, who said it came from a lab, give a 180-degree shift and say, you're crazy, you're a conspiracy theorist if you think it came from a lab. Why did they change? The only intervening event is Fauci's phone call with these guys. And I'm convinced Fauci said, we got to get our story straight. We can't let it get out. that it was gain-of-function research happening at a lab in China where this thing came from. So I think it was all about covering his backside. That's why they called us all crazy if we even questioned that this idea that it came from a bat to a pangolin to a hippopotamus to Joe Rogan, and then we all get, you know, the virus. Like, give me a break. I'm just a country boy, but I can kind of suspect, like, probably came from the lab in Wuhan, China, where they were doing this kind of experiments.
Well, I mean, early on it was easy to see why they were sensitive about it, because Judicial Watch obtained documents, I think it was last year, that showed almost immediately they were worried about what they were doing at that Wuhan Institute. They wanted to know what projects that were being funded, and reporting to Fauci and other top officials at National Institutes of Health and elsewhere about what these projects were. And we uncovered that they were engaged in gain-of-function research. So one of the reasons, in my view, especially now given the recent revelation that they were funding what they called the creation of mutant coronaviruses, that if indeed it was a lab leak, they were partly responsible for the virus that got out. Because unless it was a natural virus, it would have had to have been engineered. And if it was engineered, it was almost certainly as a result of the gain-of-function research either directly funded or the techniques that we taught the Chinese that resulted in COVID-19. Now, you know, all those are big ifs, but it certainly helps explain why that part of the debate they didn't want the public talking about. And this is, I mean, talk about arrogance.
Information laundering is really quite ferocious. It's when a huckster takes some lies and makes them sound precocious by saying them in Congress or a mainstream outlet so disinformation's origin seems slightly less atrocious.
Around the same time we filed the lawsuit, the Biden administration was actually talking about a ministry of truth, a disinformation governance board in the United States of America. So this sort of Orwellian view that this administration has about censoring Americans. And let's be clear, you know, it's illegal for the government to censor points of view they don't like.
To the point about the Disinformation Governance Board, that's how brazen it's become, that they were literally going to have some federal agency, a person in charge of some board, determine what Americans are allowed to say, what they're not allowed to say.
Federal government officials, agencies, and contractors have gone from fighting ISIS recruiters and Russian bots to censoring and deplatforming ordinary Americans and disfavored public figures.
Yes, we will be under the watchful eye of people who are intellectually dishonest, shallow, mendacious, manipulative. Because why? Because you can't believe in this system of information delivery and control unless there's something wrong with you. I mean, unless you have a deeply pessimistic and I would say even sociopathic view of the human race, you can't view the information landscape and say, we need to keep all of this stuff secret from people and only give them information that allows them to think in a certain direction. Like, only a certain kind of person thinks that way, and they're all in this space. A lot of the value of the Twitter files was just people seeing the unredacted version of reality before news organizations could get counter story together. And people have memories of that, and that's going to delay the whatever this political consolidation process is, it's going to at least delay it. So I'm not giving up hope yet, but with the internet and with the kind of general political climate where there's so much cooperation between Western NATO bloc countries, you could have a consensus about what people see all over the world, and that could happen very quickly, and I'm worried about that.
No one has done more to uncover the falsehoods about the vaccine and COVID propaganda we've been force-fed. And we're also trying to hold them directly accountable by suing over the violations of our civil rights as a result of the censorship. And hopefully that will have a national impact too. Right now, American civil rights are being violated. Their First Amendment freedoms are being curtailed in a way we've never seen before. Judicial Watch thinks this is urgent, so we've deployed a lot of resources, both in terms of investigation and litigation, and obviously educating Americans about what's at stake here.